Hi, welcome to another episode number 22 of the Good Bloke Not Woke podcast. Something a little different this time. I'm going to be sitting down talking with Brian Samson. Now, Brian's a really interesting guy. He has a company called Plugg Technologies, that's Plug with two G's. He has 80 team members, and he basically set up this company to resource talent from Latin America and flow it into the USA, so creating offshore talent for US companies. Prior, he's had over 10 years working in tech, raised $2 million as a founder, which is no mean feat, and has MBAs from UCLA and the National University of Singapore. He's also the host of the Nearshore Podcast, where they talk about success stories of people employing teams from offshore in Latin America. He's lived in Oahu in Hawaii since 2017. He's a parent of two toddlers, and he's also a father of an adopted daughter. And this is where our story really sort of what I really wanted to look at and learn from Brian, because it's no mean feat to adopt a child, follow your inspiration, take it on, and make it a success. So Brian's a really cool guy. He's got a huge heart, and he's got a lot of good wisdom to share. So enjoy this episode of the Good Bloke Not Woke podcast. So welcome, Brian Samson, to the Good Bloke Not Woke podcast, where we explore masculinity from many different perspectives. How are you doing today, and how's the weather in Hawaii?
I'm doing great, John. Thanks for having me. The weather is the same as it was yesterday and the year before and the year before, about 82 degrees Fahrenheit.
It's funny, isn't it? It got up to about 105 here yesterday, but now the temperature's dropped again. The weather in Melbourne is quite fluctuates because north wind comes off Central Australia, south wind comes off Antarctica. So, it's
Little toasty. Yeah.
yeah, it's very cool. Well, mate, we caught up and had a chat last week, and you were telling me about the fact that you do a lot of things. You've got your business, setting up business opportunities between the US and Latin America, and you've got your podcast where you tell great stories about people who've had great success and great experiences, I suppose, in that. But you're also a foster parent. And
Mhm.
I reckon that this is a really interesting area, and it caught my attention because, a lot of people don't live in a traditional family anymore. Kids are growing up, young boys are coming into families and learning how to be adults from oftentimes not their biological parent.
Mhm.
Sometimes
Mhm.
they've been abused. There's all sorts of different situations. I mean, I certainly raised two stepdaughters. They came
Mhm.
into my life when they were 4 and 6. And I sort of, even though their father was on the scene, they predominantly lived under my roof. So, I had a lot of influence there. And also, I've got very good friends who work in the foster care system. And
Mhm.
so I got really interested in that in terms of, well, first off, how did you get started? What inspired you to do that? And then if we can explore some of your learnings and your experiences.
Yeah, I'd love to. So I knew nothing about the foster care world up until a few years ago. I didn't know anybody who was a foster kid, didn't know any other foster parents. And then it was probably right around just before the pandemic here. So this is like February of 2020. So kind of setting the scene when life was still normal.
Yeah.
And my wife and I went to our church here in Oahu, Hawaii. And occasionally they'll have different speakers from places around the island that are trying to do good work. We had a speaker from foster home, and she was talking about it's tough for these kids in the foster system. They didn't choose their circumstances. Their home life was a disaster. All the advantages that I take for granted when I grew up and my kids today, they don't have. So anyway, she's going on and on about, all the kids in need here in Oahu. And, I go to church, but I wouldn't say I'm like someone who has ever said I felt called to do anything,
Mm.
and I respect everyone is on different paths and journeys. But somehow that message just hit me in the right way. And I got in the car with my wife, and usually we'll kind of like, hey, what'd you think about the sermon today, whatever, and it was like both of us got in the car and kind of at the same time looked at each other. We've got to do this. It was like we were speaking almost instantaneously. We have the resources, we can do this. And then the pandemic hit. So we normally would take a couple months, probably took like 8, 9 months. And we went through the whole licensing process, and then eventually, almost a full year later, we took in our first placement. But how it all came to be was we just happened to be at church that day and happened to hear that message, and it just struck me. There's not a lot of things that I've done that in my life, but that just
Yeah.
it just, and I had to do it.
Wow. That's, I mean, yeah, what can I say? One of those moments in time where your life changes forever. Yeah. In a good
Yeah,
way by the sound of things. Tell me, did you
yeah.
have your own children before that?
Yeah, yeah. So I'll tell you as much as you care to know about this world. But we so my wife and I had our first kid a little later in life. I was 39, she was 36 going on 37. So we had waited, also had a couple of years where it didn't happen as quickly as we wanted it to. But we were, I think, like whatever your peer group is, we were probably the median of our peer group. We met in San Francisco, California. All of our peer group were, people in their mid-30s without kids, career focused, and spending money going out to dinner and traveling, right? That was kind of our peer group. And then we actually spent a full year abroad. So I was opening up a business in Buenos Aires, Argentina, at the same time doing grad school in between California and Singapore. So just traveling all the time, and I'm so glad I got to do that.
Mm.
Incredible experiences, but it just kind of delays starting your family. So we got our family off the ground, had our wife got pregnant, had our son in May of 2019. And then we thought, we're like in our, touching 40, are we going to be able to do another one biologically? But we always wanted a second one. And, we even looked at like traditional adoption agencies. But there's this timing, where it happened with that foster care message. And if you like, John, I can tell you more about the licensing and how the placement all came to be.
Yeah, yeah, mate. I think all of it's interesting because there's probably people who listen to this podcast who it may be the first time they've ever contemplated it as well. So I'm
Yeah.
interested. Yeah,
Yeah. So the licensing, is all kind of over like a lot of Zoom trainings, a lot of recorded trainings, where I think in years past you probably go to the office and do it. We happen to have one other family that was in our church that had a couple biological kids, and they also, felt like they wanted to foster. So we had this like second group with us, on this journey, and we could share notes. We didn't really know what we were getting into though. Did our fingerprints, did our training, got our license in, I want to say October, November of 2020. So, still right in the thick of this COVID stuff.
mm,
And then it was like every time we got a phone call, we're like, this could be it. This could be the placement, right? And then we had a couple calls from the foster agency of like, hey, we've got this child. And at the time, we were kind of all over the place with the ages. Like, if they're 12, if they're 7, if they're an infant, and a lot of them have issues, right? And I'll get into that. So it's not exactly like ordering on Amazon, but it's it's also okay, and for those who are listening, to have constraints around like what you think you're okay handling.
yeah,
Now obviously, like you can't discriminate on race or anything or ethnicity or anything like that, but you can request a certain gender. You can also request age ranges, And some of them have more severe disabilities than others. Maybe there's even physical disabilities. And we thought, for our first placement, that would just be a little bit too much. But once we got licensed, I was so enthusiastic. I remember going to the mattress store here and just saying, like, I need a child's bed. That was all I said to the salesperson. They're like, well, like, what age? I'm like, I don't know. and and it was probably one of the silliest conversations that they had ever had, because we didn't know what we were gonna get. And then I started to tell them, well, actually, like, we just got licensed as foster parents. I don't know, it could be an 8-year-old, it could be a 2-year-old. And then they kind of helped us out. But then I got back home and my wife and I had a more serious conversation. Because we already had our son who was, just over a year old, and a lot of children, and it's so sad to hear this, as a father. It's so sad to hear how many of them have been abused in every which way. So we had a serious conversation about, would we expose our biological son to someone else's trauma that would then rub off on him, right? Maybe
Mm,
our son could be physically or sexually abused or something. And that was kind of a scary wake-up call. We wanted to do good, but not do it at the cost of our son's safety and security.
yeah, yeah,
So eventually we decided to settle on anybody our son's age or younger. Okay.
right.
So by then our son was probably a year and a half, and we got placed with a little 6-month-old girl. And we knew about her maybe a month ago, or a month prior to placement. This, the foster workers, the social workers try to do a good job of, like, prepping you for, who they've maybe have identified, because now we've got our different constraints, and who might be on their radar. And there was this little girl who was born in her mother, was not somebody who should have kids. Let's just say that. Drugs, jail, fraud, all sorts of stuff, and was actually homeless and drugged out during the pregnancy. And our pregnancy was fresh. I remember all the prenatal classes and books and everything we read, and, like, making sure, my wife was, like, pampered throughout, and then, and this mother did no prenatal, no medicine, no checkups, just homeless and on drugs while she's pregnant. And
Wow.
eventually she gave birth and brought the baby back home with her, but finally had a home, but it was a boarded up meth house here in Hawaii.
Wow.
And this little girl, like, here we are, focused on, like, the proper formula and diapers and everything else. And, we've got these bottle racks that we're scrubbing every night. And this little girl, was probably fed, like, potato chips and applesauce and,
Mm,
like,
wow.
and just, and there's, like, drugs all around this place. And she would just scream and scream and scream. And then the neighbors started to call, and the police would come, but they could only, and so the foster care workers would try to schedule it around when they thought she would be home. And they missed her a couple times. So we were
Right.
kind of on alert, like, Brian, and your wife, get ready. We're going to go to the house again today. Um,
Wow. So
and
they just go and take the child and bring the child straight to you?
Yeah, they needed police involvement, to enter the residence and everything. So they finally got it, and we got a call. We're gonna be there. We got her. We'll be at your place in an hour. Oh my God, let let's get ready. And this little girl came, and you know, uh dirty, with this bottle that was, like, just grimy and disgusting. And probably hadn't had a diaper change in a while. And like, wow, just makes you think about what you take for granted.
Mm,
But we brought her in, and I'm not gonna lie, the first several months were very difficult because she had drugs in her system, this little girl, and
Yeah.
drug withdrawals and screaming into the night. None of it was easy, and many foster parents actually burn out within the first year because they weren't expecting, it to be so hard. And I'm sure there's a lot more we can get into, but I'll just say one thing, because I think maybe this even ties into this podcast, John, is I think to be masculine is to take on responsibility. I think
Yeah.
it's that simple. It's to take on burdens
Yeah.
and just suck it up sometimes. It's not easy. Life isn't easy, and I'm not saying that we're heroes or anything. There's a lot of foster parents, a lot of people who've done harder things than we have. But I love that your audience are, mostly men trying to inhabit their masculinity. And I think if you
Mm,
really want to embrace that, it's take on responsibility, and take on responsibility for others and a
yeah.
responsibility for those that can't take care of themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's such a good point. I mean, first off, I'd like to acknowledge you for your courage to step into the fire like that and then hang in there. It was funny, like on a much smaller scale, I was contemplating, one of the things that makes a selfish relationship is a successful relationship is to find ways to get enthusiastic about things you just don't want to do. But
Hmm.
like having to first take in a child who's not yours, so you don't have that initial biological connection, and then to commit to caring for that child, and then committing to going the hard yards to working your way through all the trauma associated with the drugs in the child's system. And I imagine she probably screamed for hours and hours, and would have had many sleepless nights. I mean, it'd be so easy to give up, but it's the same sort of endurance and persistence and commitments that we celebrate brave soldiers for. You know,
Hmm.
when they fought in great battles, or the firefighters at World Trade Center and that sort of thing. That sort of infatigable commitment, and I think what you're talking about there is taking up the responsibility and to endure, be infatigable, to see things through to where they need to be.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well said.
Yeah, it's so interesting. How's she doing now?
Thriving. She's she had her fourth birthday a few months ago. Huge personality, funny, like everybody recognizes her. She's amazing. We formally adopted her over 2 years ago. Or I'm
Mm.
sorry, just about 2 years ago. Formally adopted her. But yeah, she's fantastic. She's
Wow.
like, you know, uh my son is like my mini me, but my fathers and daughters, you kind of have this like almost like a best friend relationship. So she's like that.
Wow. I've got a really beautiful friend. We've been friends for, golly, well, I mean, next week it's going to be, let me figure this out. It's going to be 44 years. She was this, I was a gym instructor at a fitness center, and I used to teach aerobics classes, and this gorgeous girl used to come into my
Mhm.
class, and I'd almost lose track of myself in the class because I couldn't stop looking at her. And back in those days, it was women's gym and men's gym, and so I could never have an opportunity to actually connect with her and communicate with her. So I was always talking to the staff in the women's gym about her. And anyway, women's gym manager uh, came out to me one night and said, "John, her name is Tracy, and she's having her 21st birthday on Saturday night. Here's the address. She said you can come if you want to."
That's great.
But wow, that's so interesting. And I hadn't even spoken to her. And I turned up at her 21st at about 10:30 in the evening, and she became one of the loves of my life. And
Yeah.
then our relationship lasted maybe 6 months before she broke it off, and I was shattered and devastated. And many years later, we sat down, and I said to her, what happened back then? And she said, "Oh my God, don't you know?" She said, "I was bulimic, I was distressed, I was really struggling, and I didn't want to drag you through that, so I had to let you go." And I went, "Oh, okay." So anyway, we've remained deeply close friends, and my wife loves her, but she never got to have her own kids. And so she got into fostering and adopting, and she was amazing. But the stories she told me about what kids go through in the world, I mean, I just found it appalling that adults could treat kids that way. And I get a sense the world needs more adults to show up and say, "Hey, that kid can come to our home, and
Yeah,
we'll do the hard
100%.
yards till they feel safe."
100%. It's the way some of these kids are treated and abused. Not even to talk about sex trafficking and all this other stuff going on in the world. The world needs people, men and women, to step up and care for these kids that don't have anybody fighting for them.
Yeah, yeah, so true. It's and it does take a special level of resilience. And I think that, it's funny thing is that we all imagine ourselves to be more wonderful than we are. We imagine that, if we're in the right place at the right time and something terrible went down, that we would be the one who would rescue somebody or whatever. But sometimes the test comes and it goes past, and we don't act. But the glory of those things is probably never going to come for most people. But the real essence of life and living a genuine, sincere existence is really looking inside when it starts to feel too hard and asking
Yeah, I
ourselves,
think
can I go further here?
yeah, I totally agree. I think maybe I'll and this is probably with your audience too, big government, right? But I think what happens when government gets too big is that people kind of have this mindset of like the government will solve it,
Hmm.
or like someone should do something about that,
Yeah,
right? Someone needs to do something about that. Well,
yeah,
what does that mean, right? But when you have a tiny government, that means that it's really for the citizens to take
yeah,
action and do stuff about that. So I think there is something cultural about that too. When because honestly, even if you look at much poorer countries than the US or Australia, the family unit, is sometimes stronger. And if, somebody's down on their luck, like they take them in, and there might be 15 people living in a two-bedroom apartment, but like they'll
yeah,
they'll take them in and care for each other. But when on the other side, when you have these rich countries with big, powerful governments, with enormous budgets, somebody should do something about that, and not enough
yeah,
people actually feel like they need to.
yeah, yeah. It's so interesting, isn't it? I was listening to a podcast about that very thing this morning. It's there's an interesting thing around victimhood and treating
Mm.
people as victims and classifying people as victims. And so then, from one side of politics, you can then be assured that those people are going to vote for you. So the intentions don't appear to be genuine, but what ends up happening is you have very big government giving lots of people jobs, and then you have people who are in a job with perhaps not enough to do. So then you end up with little groups of people coming together and creating regulations for
Mm.
something that they think sounds good, you know. But then the narrative of the government is that, as you said, we're going to take care of you, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And I don't think that disempowers anybody. It just gives us an excuse.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. Exactly
you
right.
know and it's a bit like we're talking on the podcast, they were talking about masculinity and how men have sort of been pushed back, that any form of masculinity is toxic
Mhm.
and that sort of stuff,
Yeah,
and about
yeah.
all that's left for young men now is to go to the gym and look buff. but
Yeah.
actually having masculine attitudes is not a good thing. And what one of the commentators was saying is it wasn't masculinity that was the problem, it was toxic masculinity. And instead of calling out toxic masculinity, they just kept calling out, the activists kept calling out masculinity. And Harvey Weinstein came up in the conversation, and one of the commentators said so beautifully, said, where were his friends? I mean, surely they must have noticed what he was up to. Where were the men around him that were going to deal with that dude, for the good of everybody?
Right.
And it's a bit like this is part of the I suppose the area that I'm investigating around local sports clubs and that sort of thing, where more men can come together and support each other to show up more.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then the perpetrators of domestic violence, they leave clues, and somebody notices. And so here we have what you're inspired to do was to pick up the mantle of another area of society that needs good men and good women to show up with some courage. How did your friends respond?
So when we were going through the process, we had then moved to Hawaii. And, it's funny, like our peer group was much different when we got to Hawaii. There's a tremendous amount of military here.
Hmm.
About 10% of the population is military or military adjacent. And if
Oh,
there's anything, I've learned about a lot of our friends, family friends are now, either active duty or retired, and because we're not young kids anymore either. So they're very service oriented. They put service above self. So I think our San Francisco friends were like, "Wow, that's cool. What are these guys doing?" But our Hawaii friends were awesome. How can we help? And they're
yeah. Wow.
giving clothes and
Wow.
bottle racks and whatever they could find. Like they mobilized and gathered around us. And actually, when we had our official adoption, we had about 10 families from our community join us in the courtroom and like be
Wow.
there to support the adoption. It was beautiful. But you really, and I think about a lot of those families, and so many of them were led by men and women, husband and wife, that were very service above self people. Now, we were the only ones that were fostering, but we felt like we weren't alone.
Yeah.
They wanted to support us, and we support them, and that's a real key part of any successful community.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. That's beautiful. I love that. I used to train the PTIs, the physical training instructors in the Australian Navy, back in the early 80s. And I was amazed at those guys. They've got such a service ethic, and
Yeah,
just if something needs doing, well, we'll do it. There's
yeah,
no question. There's no later isn't a word that fits very well into their vocabulary.
yeah,
And I
yeah,
wonder whether we forget that about our service people. I mean, I haven't liked what's gone on in the world in the last 40 years or 50 years with all these wars that probably could have been solved diplomatically. And so there's been a lot of carnage and a lot of damage and a lot of trauma, but we forget about the positive side of military service and how people who do come out of the military do have that leaning into service. And I think it's probably, I mean, one of my great teachers, Harry Palmer, said it's probably the desire to serve that has young people be so enthusiastic about signing up for the military in the first place. Yeah.
yeah. And I think the other element of that I really respect about how militaries are organized is, you go through the suck together,
Yeah.
you come out of it, and the more it sucks, the stronger the bonds, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so like that family I mentioned early on, they ended up adopting a little boy, and we're still close because, we kind of endured this process together. And same with a lot of
Wow.
our community, just as the military, they go through hard things together. And like sometimes I see them because people pass through Hawaii all the time, and I'll meet their army buddies, that they hadn't seen in 10 years, but their bonds are tight, even though they hadn't seen each other in 10 years, because they went through some hard things together.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just had a really good mate of mine staying here last week. He's an Australian. He's a few years older than me, and he served in Vietnam in the tank regiment. And he then joined the federal police, went into drug enforcement, and ended up in the US. And he's lived in the US for years and years and years. And but he comes back to Australia to catch up with his army buddies. You know, they
Yeah,
have
yeah,
reunions.
I love
You
it.
know,
I
and
love
it's
it.
like, yeah, it's and he's got great stories. And you know, we were sitting chatting the other night, and he was just sad because he said, you know, our numbers are dwindling. You know, the boys are slowly going. You know, and it's yeah, and it's like his closeness to them is closer than his own family that he grew up with. It's
Mhm, mhm.
it's so interesting. That's so interesting. So, I mean, I'm just going to ask you for an observation here. Where do you feel like we can improve in society or help each other improve, like as men, to have more men be willing to step into the, I suppose, the inconvenience and maybe a little bit of the clipping of the wings to actually step into foster parenting to relieve the suffering for
Yeah.
just one child?
I think there's several things. That's an excellent question. As I'm sure we probably listen to the same types of podcasts too, and the same types of people. Scott Galloway talks about this a lot. Like the war on young men.
Mhm.
But it starts with having parents that teach their own children anything worth doing is hard,
Yeah.
right? So anything worth anything is hard. Otherwise, what's the point? And that's something that I want to really impart on my own two children. Like, kids want to give up or that's too hard or mom and dad have to swoop in and do it for them. Self-esteem comes from overcoming adversity, overcoming hard things, and you got to start that early. So I think it's the societal part of telling parents you want your kids to experience hard things. They need to. They'll never be great
Great.
citizens if they don't overcome hard things. And then continuing to test them and to the point where they see the big picture of, hey, I'm going to try this really hard thing because I know I'm going to come out of it better.
Mm.
That's a much different attitude than, I just want to like take the easy road in life. So creating that environment, I think is really, really important. The second thing I'd say is that, there are, I'll just talk about foster care for a second. There are 400,000, sometimes 440,000 kids in foster care just in the US alone, not even thinking worldwide. And so that means that there's a lot of kids that need great homes. So part of this is recruiting and awareness. So hopefully me
Mm.
telling my story, I was just a regular guy and I still am a regular guy. And like there was nothing special about me, I'm not a Navy SEAL or anything crazy like that. I'm just a regular guy. So part of this is just creating awareness, like you could do this too. You don't have to be anything special to do this.
Yeah.
Now the third part of that though is again, just with foster care, the burnout is high. A high percentage of foster parents don't make it a full year. And it is really difficult just to recruit any foster parents. And then
Wow.
if ones you bring on are burning out because it's difficult. So that means that society needs more peer groups and support and even things like respite care, like it's kind of like foster care and training, where you relieve other foster parents for a weekend so
Yeah.
they can fill their cup and rejuvenate, take a 2-day trip and come back fresh and ready to take that. It's not a huge ask on you. You just cover them for a weekend, cover the
Yeah.
foster kids for a weekend. So I think it comes down to creating environments where adversity is a good thing, not something to run away from, bringing awareness to this, and then support groups for everybody. So we keep retention strong, attrition low, recognizing that like it's meant to be hard.
Yeah.
That's okay. That's okay.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? I mean, yeah, I mean, what's the old African proverb? It takes a village to raise a child.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah, yeah.
it's so interesting. You've just reminded me that my older brother, who I don't really see or get on with, but when I was a teenager and he was in his late teens, early 20s, he and his friends used to go to orphanages and take kids out for the weekend.
Hmm.
Yeah. And they'll just
Awesome.
pick them up on Friday night, just take them out for the weekend and do stuff with them and then drop them back. And they did that fairly regularly. And that sort of gave those kids a different experience in the outing, but also probably gave some respite to their normal
That's
carers.
fantastic. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah. And it's interesting what you're saying about, doing hard stuff and, and having like things are difficult, they are hard. But when you do the hard stuff and you get through the other end, there's a new layer of self-belief, a new layer of
Hmm.
confidence, a new layer of self-trust. And I think one of the things where I've just discovered recently where a lot of young people are going off is they consider anything hard to be trauma.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I'll even mention, I've been an entrepreneur for 9 years.
Mhm.
And I've been punched in the face more than I could even count, right? It's every day is a new battle, but every day you survive, it's if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger, right? Every day you survive. There's almost nothing that could come on my desk today that would freak me out. Almost
Yeah.
nothing, right?
Yeah.
Like you have this kind of self-assuredness, like I've
Mhm.
made it this far, I've gotten through the fire, and you're spot on, John. It should not be looked upon as trauma, by the way, should actually not be looked upon negatively. It should
Yeah.
just be retitled as adversity. And
Yeah.
hey, like what kind of adversity did you overcome today?
Exactly. Yes. I used to always tell my kids as they walked out the door in the mornings, I'd say, take a risk, just be smart about it.
Yeah, yeah, love it.
But it was like when my son was 15, he was at a school that had a really good music program because music was the only thing that appealed to him at school. And he was the drummer, and he'd been handed the mantle as the number one drummer in the school. And they decided to put on a very, very big production of Jesus Christ Superstar. And they put together a music ensemble with outside musicians, and the only student in the music ensemble was the drummer.
Hmm.
And he would come home from practice and he'd be freaking out, say, Dad, it's too hard. I can't do it. He said, I have to play all the way through. It's like, and he said, and it changes. And I'd say to him, well, mate, it's okay. It's up to you. If you don't want to do it, let him know, because you got to give him
Mhm.
time to, you got to give him time. And all I did was just give him space to have his meltdowns. Meltdowns, and eventually the show came, and I sat there in the audience with tears rolling down as he just did it, and I saw incredible growth in him as a human being after facing
Yeah.
and navigating his way through something that he was really scared of.
Yeah,
And
it reminds me of I think that's fantastic, and you've raised a great kid. It reminds me of a couple of years ago, because all this adversity gives you perspective, right? And a couple of years ago, we had someone on one of my companies, and they were freaking out, or like all this client stuff that they had to deal with, just like it was freaking them out. And I used the perspective. I actually told them, about what my daughter had gone through in her early life, like burns on her skin from meth, and horrible stuff. Like that's trauma. What you're going through, you can figure this out. Okay. It's not that bad. Like, have a little perspective here, right?
yes, yes, somebody's beating you with streamers. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
have a little perspective.
it is hilarious. And what I noticed is that my son has a partner in his life, and he met her while he was playing the drums. He was 17, and they're still together. They're in their mid-30s now, and they've got 2 little boys. And she is awesome with these 2 little boys. I walked past one day, and Jack, the older boy, he was like 2, and he's got this ride-on toy that's got 4 wheels, and it's not stable at all in terms of front and back movement. And he was standing up on it, thinking he was as proud as punch. And I said to her, "Aren't you concerned?" And she goes, "Oh, if he falls, he'll learn something, you know."
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So good. Those little boys will grow up tough, you know. It's such a journey, and I think that one of the challenges that we do have, and I've talked about this a lot on the podcast, is that in wealthy societies, we get a little bit too caught up in our comforts, and our life challenge is not survival, it's like keeping our comforts. And so we get a little bit lazy, we get a little bit self-absorbed, and we miss out on the richness of
Mm.
stepping outside of that, you know. And I mean, how do we do it? I mean, have you seen anything in your community where there's stuff going on where people are being inspired to step outside that? And
Yeah. Yeah. So John, you asked about just kind of getting inspired to make a difference and make an impact. And you know, it's funny, like the communities that have it the worst tend to have the people that want to step up the most, right? And the other ones, like you kind of get lulled into your comfort. And I look at the US, and there's a lot of just all this conversations around what I think are just kind of like trivial matters, and like all this debate around how many genders there are and everything. But if you're worried about where your next meal is coming from, you are not worried about this stuff, right?
no,
So this is like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and like food, safety, shelter, all this other stuff has long been taken care of. So now they look for their own problems, right? Like they try to seek out problems. So I think a lot of this inspiration is just wake up calls. Like,
yeah,
you know, you're in a very fortunate place. Not everybody else is where you are on the hierarchy of needs, right? There's a lot of people that need some support. Think about all the impact, all that you could do, right? And by the way, you could learn from each other. You'll learn more about adversity, and they'll receive resources from you, right? And it's kind of a win-win. So I just hope that anybody listening, again, I'm just a regular guy and nothing special here. You just gotta take the first step, and you'll be amazed at what you can do and what you can do for others.
yeah. I think, I feel in your message there, one of the critical elements is get out of your own space and find where you can make a contribution to the community. It could be becoming a foster parent, it could be supporting another foster parent, which is gold, or it could be coaching a baseball team or a
Yep.
football team, somewhere where we can take care of the kids and take care of the generations that are emerging. Mate, one final quick question. When you were growing up, was there somebody that you saw as this role model of sort of a masculine or healthy man that you wanted to aspire to?
Yeah, I was lucky enough to grow in a house with my dad around all the time, right? And I realized not everyone is that lucky. I didn't realize that until much later on in life. But you see all the stats, there's nothing that drives the two different forks in the road for kids more than is there a strong male role model or a father in the home. And so that's my dad. He's still alive to this day,
Wow.
and we had dinner when he wasn't traveling. We had dinner every night at 5:30 as a family, and that creates this foundation, and I don't take it for granted.
No, thank you, mate. Thank you. It's beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Brian, for contributing to the conversation and helping get some more really helpful perspectives out there. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And remember, if you enjoy this podcast, please share it around because, Brian's perspectives can be very helpful to many, many people. And always remember, when you're out there in the world, be that adult that you needed when you were a little kid and you're in trouble. or your friend. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks for giving me this platform.